welcome to our virtual panel U1, Reconsiderations of the Modern Novel. I will briefly introduce our three speakers and then we will proceed by following the conference program. Our first speaker today is Dr. Hanna. First of all, please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name. She graduated with a PhD in English at the University of Illinois at Chicago in December of last year. Her research interests lie in 19th century British literature, the novel, narrative critiques in 19th century liberalism, post-colonial and post-secular critique, and print and media culture. Dr. Khan recently completed a dissertation on 19th century realism, Victorian omniscient narration, and the role of the character-driven narrator in novels by Thackeray, Trollope, and Joseph Conrad. Dr. Khan's presentation is entitled Modernity, Material Interests, and the Narrator in Joseph Conrad's Nostromo. Our second speaker is Dr. Martina Jauch. Dr. Jauch received her doctoral degree in comparative literature from Purdue University. She is a permanent lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences, the environmental campus Birkenfeld in Trier, Germany, since 2010, where she is teaching English, intercultural communication, and digitalization seminars. Her research interests lie in trauma novels, the German Bildungsroman, and environmental narration, and she has recently attended the Cornell School of Criticism and Theory and numerous other academic conferences. The title of her presentation today is Blocked Democratic Vistas in John dos Passos's The 42nd Parallel. Our third speaker is Sierra Getz. Sierra is a doctoral researcher at the University of Brighton studying the effects of censorship of popular fictions from 1950 to 1970 on post-war American society with a specific focus on the literary works of Bradbury, Salinger, Heller, and Vonnegut. She holds degrees in secondary English education and creative and critical writing from DePaul University and the University of Sussex, respectively. Her presentation today is entitled Fahrenheit 451, Book Publishing During the McCarthyism Period. With that being said, I'm going to observe the time. Everyone will have about 20 minutes to do the presentation. When 2 minutes remain, I will raise my hands like this in the sign of victory. So hopefully you'll notice me. With that being said, I'll let Dr. Khan begin.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So my talk is Modernity, Material Interests, and the Narrator in Joseph Conrad's Nostromo. Literary critic J. Hillis Miller hones in on a specific usage of anecdotal history in which Joseph Conrad defines the underlying crux of his novel, Nostromo. Upon his voyage to Central or South America in the 1870s, Conrad heard a story in which a theft of silver was committed on a lighter boat amid sociopolitical turmoil in South America. Citing Conrad's own testimony, he writes, "It was only when it dawned upon me that the purloiner of the treasure need not necessarily be a confirmed rogue, that he could even be a man of character, an actor, and possibly a victim in the changing scenes of a revolution. It was only then that I had the first vision of a twilight country which was to become the province of Sulaco, with its high shadowy Sierra and its misty Campo." Writing about the same anecdote, Michael Greaney states, "The tale was subsequently augmented in his imagination by a curious range of secondary sources. A volume of nautical memoirs purchased in a second-hand bookshop, gossip half forgotten, and a historical work, Don Jose Avellanos's History of 50 Years of Misrule, that exists only in the world of the novel." With Miller designating Conrad as recipient of an audible history, and with Greaney identifying Conrad's usage of secondary source material as very much a part of the process of fictionalization, Conrad's novel demonstrates the act of writing just as it happens in time. Given the insightful arc that J. Hillis Miller and Michael Greaney track in the uneasy development of Conrad's language and style, and the significance of character to the composition of his novels, this paper examines Conrad's distrust of language, including the writing and development of his own literary achievements, and his yearning for a storytelling modality rooted in past expressions of oral or less discursively official narratives. I find this a literary expression and topical problematic in his narrator in Nostromo. At once personified, local to Sulaco, and knowledgeable about its past and current politics, the narrator also remains omniscient in his revelation of events. He maintains a distance from the other characters, even in his own rendering of them. Although referenced to only briefly, Conrad's narrator is a Sulaco denizen embedded in the political turmoil that encompasses the coast. He states, those of us whom business or curiosity took to Sulaco in these years before the first advent of the railway can remember the steadying effect of the San Tome mine upon the life of that remote province. The outward appearances had not changed then as they have changed since, as I am told, with cable cars running along the streets of the Constitution and carriage roads far into the country to Rincon and other villages where the foreign merchants and the ricos generally have their modern villas, and a vast railway of goods yard by the harbor which has a quayside, a long range of warehouses, and quite serious organized labor troubles of its own. Already situating himself into the fictional world of Sulaco and narrating the pervasive pull of the mine over the town even before modern developments such as the cable car or the railway subsumed the region, the narrator gives a first-hand account of the way the region has changed over time, the way riots occur commonly in Sulaco, with the vast railway, Sulaco's primary embodiment of modernity, which gives way to organized labor troubles. The narrator holds a personified designation using an omniscient narrative register, but simultaneously departing from the objectivity of third-person omniscient narration. He uses this to claim, I am told, signaling that he is both narrator of the story and recipient of external information. He both presents a narrative and extrapolates the information presented to him by other characters. Furthermore, if he interacts with other characters and their versions of Sulaco, then this alludes to the idea that he too is a character in the fiction as well. Thus, in Conrad's oscillating delineation of this narrator, a narrator that fits into the narrative much like a character, he finds a way to both transform and unsettle what a community of characters looks like. On the one hand, Conrad has produced a narrator that appears like a character, and on the other hand, has composed characters all scrambling, albeit unsuccessfully, to be narrators of Sulaco in their own right. Martin de Caude, in his journalistic heroism, Don Jose Avellanos in his historiographical endeavors to narrate the politically unpredictable governance of Costaguana, the Montero brothers who produced their own pamphlets of propaganda before laying siege to Sulaco, and Captain Mitchell in his enthusiasm for Sulaco's progressive entrance into modernity and history, all these characters strive to advance a narrative of Sulaco, all different from one another's and the narrators. Two characters in particular, Captain Joesph Mitchell and Sir John, are quick to advance a progressive narrative of Sulaco's material interest, but without accounting for its exploitative operations. And unlike other characters such as de Caude and Avellanos, who mobilize the printed publication for their narrative, the former opt for casual speech and a candid approach in their retellings of Sulaco. When speaking about esteemed railway captain and disciplinarian Nostromo and thwarting riots that follow any political upheaval, Captain Mitchell states, a crazy mob does not discriminate. Under Providence, we owed our preservation to my capataz de cargadores, as they called him in the town, a man who, when I discovered his value, sir, was just the boatswain of an Italian ship, a big Genoese ship, one of those few European ships that ever came to Sulaco with a general cargo before the building of the National Central. He left her on account of some very respectable friends he made here, his own countrymen, but also, I suppose, to better himself. Sir, I'm a pretty good judge of character. Even under the mounting pressure of political fallout, Captain Mitchell misguidedly sings the praises of Nostromo, whose services present as much use value to him in Ribeira as it will to Charles Gould in moving the silver. However, it is the narrator who formally reveals Captain Mitchell was partial to white waistcoats and really very communicative under his air of pompous reserve. In the narrator's estimation, readers obtain an undoing of Captain Mitchell's myopic accolades of Nostromo, whose fame in the region preserves the material interests that prop up the ever-transforming regimes and the meddlesome foreign capital sustaining them. Michael Greaney also provides a cogent analysis of Captain Mitchell's notion of progress imagined for Sulaco. It never occurs to Mitchell that the visitors whom he conducts on grueling tours of the regenerated town might find his anecdotes baffling rather than vivid or astounding. He manages the unlikely feat of presenting a grossly simplified account of Sulaco's recent past in a form almost incomprehensible to anyone who isn't already acquainted with the region. As Sulaco's oral historian or one-man heritage industry, Mitchell is plainly and comically inept, the novel's stooge rather than his trusted proxy. But while it's easy to laugh at him, one wonders whether an even more gifted raconteur could improve much on the efforts of Sulaco's merciless cicerone. The problem is not that Sulaco deserves a better storyteller, but that the storyteller simply isn't a viable mouthpiece for historical narratives of such formidable complexity. Just as Greene identifies Mitchell's lack of understanding regarding Costaguana's politically charged history and its current state evincing a tumultuous congruity, he also affirms Mitchell's limitations as serving as one of Sulaco's so-called narrators, when in fact he participates in a long list of residents or businessmen that exploit Nostromo for their own gain. But Captain Mitchell is not the only one to advance a limited understanding of the way Sulaco runs, depending upon the aid of actors such as Nostromo. Nor is he the only one to speak so confidently about Sulaco's uninterrupted track towards modernity and progress, indeed its entrance into history and the national imaginary upon helming one of the two major ports of nascent global capitalism in the region. This is what the novel's wide and somewhat confounding ensemble of characters formalizes about the narration. That it is as much about Sulaco's perceived modernity as it is about the characters that narrate this progress. When in conversation with Amelia Gold upon arriving in Sulaco, Sir John of the National Central Railway states, "We have been upset twice in one day on the brink of very deep ravines," he was telling Mrs. Gold in an undertone. "And when we arrived here at last, I don't know what we should have done without your hospitality. What an out-of-the-way place Sulaco is, and for a harbor, too, astonishing." Amelia, sensing the air of superiority in her guests, responds with, but we are very proud of it. It used to be historically important. The highest ecclesiastical court for two viceroyalities sat here in the olden time." She instructed him with animation. As the conversation continues, Sir John, just like Captain Mitchell before him, ignores Sulaco's unsteady, if not resistant entrance into modernity and industrialism by remarking, we can't give you your ecclesiastical court back again, but you shall have more steamers, a railway, a telegraph cable, a future in the great world which is worth infinitely more than any amount of ecclesiastical pass. You shall be brought in touch with something greater than two viceroyalities. But I had no notion that a place on a seacoast could remain so isolated from the world. If it had been 1,000 miles inland now, most remarkable. Has anything ever happened here for 100 years before today? Here one can recognize the way in which Sir John equates the hallmarks of 19th century industrialism, the steamer and the railway, with the pinnacle of modernity, secularity, and the way its futurity is cartoned off from the past. Moreover, when claiming that Sulaco stands isolated and apart from the rest of the world, Sir John, though negligent of the situation, already ascertains a key point in which the Sulaco he imagines and pawns off to Amelia remains characteristically different from reality. The very isolation of Sulaco and its geographic and environmental resistance to modernity, indeed its long reluctance towards enterprises like the OSN and the National Central Railway, recall a history that the narrator tells right at the beginning. This history details a legacy of exploitation, but is treated with rather ignorance by enterprisers such as Sir John and Charles Gold. When Sir John gleefully inquires, has anything ever happened here for 100 years before today, the narrator's historical tale fills in the gaps of a lesson that should have been heeded long ago in the pursuit of the San Tome silver mine. As the narrator recalls the history of Azuera, its rough terrain and landscape housing its secret treasure, he assumes a true narratorial and storytelling mode. Though writing from an omniscient point of view, the narrative also appears yarn-like, full of folklore, legend, tradition, and myth, the latter emphasizing that a personified and character-defined narrator can only opt for such a yarn as a chosen method of narration. If Captain Mitchell and Sir John narrate their versions of Sulaco using offhand and candid remarks, then the narrator's tale also appears more casual than official recalls a version of Sulaco worth relating to the same recipients of Captain Mitchell's and Sir John's confined versions. The narrator states, the story goes on also that within men's memory, two wandering sailors, Americanos perhaps, but gringos of some for certain, talked over gambling, good-for-nothing mozo, and the three stole a donkey to carry for them a bundle of dry sticks, a water skin, and provisions enough to last a few days. Thus accompanied and with revolvers at their belt, they started to chop their way with machetes through the thorny scrub of the neck of the peninsula. On the second evening, an upright spiral of smoke, it could have been from their campfire, was seen for the first time within memory of man standing up faintly upon the sky above a razor-backed ridge on the stony head. The crew of a coasting schooner, lying becalmed 3 miles off the shore, stared at it with amazement till dark. A Negro fisherman living in a lonely hut in a little bay nearby had seen the start and was on the lookout for some sign. He called out to his wife just as the sun was about to set. They had watched the strange portent with envy, incredulity, and awe. The impious adventurers gave no other signs. The sailors, the Indian, and the stolen burro were never seen again. As to this mozo, a Sulaco man and his wife paid for some masses, and the poor four-footed beast, being without sin, had probably been permitted to die. But the two gringos, spectral and alive, are believed to be dwelling to this day among the rocks, under the fatal spell of their success. Their souls cannot tear themselves away from their bodies, mounting guard over the discovered treasure. The narrator tells the story at the start of the novel, both as cautionary warning about the silver and before readers can glean how various characters have manipulated the seeming promise of the mine. When the narrator speaks of Azuera, its resistant waters, his presence also reworks the stakes of the realist novel. Noting how the arrival of the OSN calms years of solitude for Sulaco, he states, year after year, the black hulls of their ships had gone up and down the coast, in and out, past Azuera, past the Isabels, past Punta Mala, disregarding everything but the tyranny of time. Scholars of the English novel, such as Elizabeth Deeds Ermarth and Elizabeth Carolyn Miller, among others, have noted that the passage of time and the diachronic narration of the realist novel coalesce into a narrative of progress. Conrad and Nostromo, however, demonstrates otherwise in Sulaco's confrontation with modernity. The narrator's authenticity and version of realism, moreover, is mobilized by undermining the literary objective of realist narration. One exemplification of this is how many characters, beyond the two examined here, narrate disagreeable versions of progress in comparison to each other as well as the narrator. Moreover, if the realist novel's two most significant hallmarks remain the abstraction of the narrator and that narrative continuity translates into a progressive story, then the narrator's retelling of many narratives, indeed the history of the cursed silver lying in the wild fortresses of Azuera that comes at the beginning of the novel and signals to the cyclical redundancy amounting from gold's mine, challenges those core features of realism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanna. Dr. Jauch?
All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry, it's a little bit dark in my background because it's already about 10 o'clock here. And apparently my lighting is not quite as sufficient as I had thought previously. So I've decided to not be in my office anymore at that hour. I've decided to concentrate on the first part of the trilogy, the 42nd parallel, for a number of reasons, written around 1930 to around 1932, published in 1937, but there is a distinct difference after 1932, where Dos Passos' ideas on history tend to take quite a turn, according to most critics, a complete turn around as well. So there's a little bit of that inclusion as well that's foreshadowed, but I'm not going into the exact debate in too much detail, hopefully. Yeah, often described as John Dos Passos' attempt to compose the great American novel, the first volume of his trilogy transmits the author's vision that many of the foundations of the historical present are built on shaky ground. It provides a counterpoint to earlier scenarios by Hawthorne, for whom the revolution would bring about a truer American who would synthesize positive qualities of the nation, or Whitman who found democratic vistas not so much in the present or past. Whitman saw them instead in the future, justification by potential, as Goldman calls it, and it could be expressed by the poet as a vessel for the true yet diverse character of the nation's inhabitants, nature, and civilization's achievements. In the 42nd parallel, life is a fragmented collage of individual sorrows and anxieties, where potential success is stifled in the early stages and villains become flourishing entrepreneurs, most importantly, J. Ward Morehouse, who we'll briefly get into, and I'll concentrate on 3 or 4 main characters, not all the 11 that tend to show up in the novel as well, for the sake of shortness. The novel inverses the Horatio Alger stories by presenting previous triumphs, such as Edison's inventions, as vain attempts to overcome their environment's stifling structures. Dos Passos invariably demonstrates that the camera eye and its artificial lens, which merely presents the state of society rather than explicitly connects events, in a sequence affirming historical causality, have replaced the individual with the power to relate to strangers in various space and time periods, because they could be connected by the great American epic story. No longer can a single individual encompass the immensity of the nation as an independent narrator. Only the reader can gain true introspection by being confronted with the characters' fates and their careers, mostly failed careers. Even the attentive and curious reader will search fruitlessly for a guide through the moral swamp of the novel. They are driven by the forceful movement provided by the swift progression of camera eyes, newsreels, and glimpses of narratives. There's a total of 4 different types, 3 I've mentioned here, of how he constructs the novel, all of them with various critical attachments to it, which we'll not get into yet at that point. That do not add up to a plot necessarily in which they could channel all their irresolution, self-deceit, and haplessness, and, as Dr. O states in his foreword, their failure to find empowerment in love or social rebellion. His characters are unable to follow their democratic vistas and do not find a secure niche in this unstable society. Their compulsory movement does not indicate any teleology toward a definite place. The routes that the characters wander never arrive at a particular location, as for Robinson Crusoe or Huck Finn, let alone do they lead to a fulfilled and completed state of being. The journeys of this democracy's inhabitants are by no means exemplary of the character's valued opinion of the motion itself. It is only in nostalgic songs or the world of classical or utopian literature where they can envision a kind of moral and spiritual guidance in an endless search for freedom, vitality, and possibility. This presentation will attempt to delve a little deeper into the ideas of democracy, freedom, and success. I've left out history as a separate one, but it tends to merge in a little bit. To discern Dos Passos' stance about how the nation's past relates to its future and the pathways of individual power. In the tradition of Whitman's undemocratic vistas, see the title of the presentation, he brings Whitman's idea of democracy and the principle of one yet many into the 20th century. Yet he portrays the changes in interpreting the term as well. For Whitman, the basis of democracy lies in the harmonic natural order in which individual organisms live in a mysterious coexistence. Whitman stipulates that democratic America is the accumulation of persons who are mutually connected but not reduced to a unanimous mass. The curious mix of variety and freedom was imagined to be the greatest lesson to New World politics at the time. And Whitman adds another layer of connection, that of spirituality and souls, to this bodily democratic whole. Most often, the poem, I Sing the Body Electric, has been interpreted as a nod to technology and electricity as a means of connecting and communicating. Verbs like engirthing, discorruption, as well as charging demonstrate this electric democratic nationality, which he talks about in his 1872 preface to As a Strong Bird on Pinions Free. Literature is believed to tie the soul and body of America together in nurturing the moral and spiritual consciences, to implant the democratic idea in people. Now, the preamble of Dos Passos trilogy states that USA is the discourse of individuals and narrates the life story of around 11 characters living in diverse geographical regions, disparate family structures, and of varying social status, who might know each other, but often only superficially, and sometimes we don't even find out if they know each other. The objective of Dos Passos is using a montage and camera eye technique to let them tell their stories without his interference, as he aimed at total objectivity by giving conflicting views. It is, in a sense, an equally eclectic and explosive meeting of moral and spiritual consciences. Had too much with consciousness in my research. Consciousness, as Whitman's democratic idea of electrical exchange. It is further similar to Madison's concept of freedom of speech, which presupposed the healthy exchange of opinions and the necessity to critique authorities as the basis of a truly successful democracy. The formation of a nation in Dos Passos is achieved through the open discourse and the forging of connections of strangers in an age which had been shaped by the First World War and the impossibility of communicating the horrors that were experienced during this time. Being on the negative side of modernism, Dos Passos is more alert to the senseless destruction and lack of language to link subjective perception to external events. What remains in the 42nd parallel is a roman à thèse that fails to connect their fates to achieve a sense of closure, as well as portrayal of conflicting impulses of history on a path toward a new democracy. Democracy remains a journey and pathway toward the future, whose destination is not yet known to readers, and in many ways not Dos Passos either. His characters remain in motion and restless, illustrating a process of becoming a new people, and thus referring back to the original American search for radical forms of freedom, independence, and possibility, as Butler claims. His story emulates Rip Van Winkle's escape from hierarchical society, Huck Finn's lighting out to the territories, and Thoreau's leaving of his garden after 2 years. The reader is confronted with a new take on this original American story, with an economically and politically leftist exploration of the powers of the human mind against circumstances through a naturalist novelist's description. One of the protagonists, and the earliest to be introduced, Mac, pauses with his friend the anarchist Pablo to watch distant fires before heading off to join his girl Encarnacion, a symbol for romanticized revolution, then decides to leave for Mexico. He also leaves behind a child and a wife, which is an additional unfortunate circumstance. As he says, he'd picked up a little Spanish from Encarnacion and a vague idea of the politics of the revolution, and is now off to join Zapata. Mac's wife and son are left behind as his leftist views consume this character in its entirety. Similarly, Ben's relationship with his family is weakened, but ultimately results in the compromise of him becoming a labor lawyer, albeit not for the reason his parents would envision, to mainly also make money. They only approve the decision because, quote, a clever lawyer can protect the workers and the poor Jews and make money too, unquote. Nick, an Italian anarchist, claims that women aim to distract the men from their cause to integrate them into capitalist society. Ben sees himself as a martyr and is ultimately punished, 10 years imprisonment, whereas his relationship to Mary French becomes pointless and futile. They essentially just, dwell apart, I guess we could phrase nicely. As both forget their love for one another, forsake domestic goals as hierarchical and capitalist, neither is able to effect change, and both enter different forms of demise. Clearly, the electric connection that could forge a new sense of the nation dies alongside their connection as well. Identity becomes a new protagonist, as love is formulated only sparingly. While none of the characters is only despicable and villainous, their cries fall outside the speech of the people and remain unheard by the rest of America. The villain instead becomes the public media and the mass culture of public relations, whose manipulative nature leads to this deafness towards good change and the character's alienation from the mainstream. In contrast to American expansionism, Dos Passos paints a picture exposing that the supposed Whitmanian storybook democracy has been blocked by the changes in history and society that have replaced any thought of an American Adam as an archetype. It is a sprawling world of perpetual change, as Butler says, that has redefined what true progress is for the nation in the aftermath of the First World War. The characters are disillusioned as there is no trickling down of prosperity. Industrialists are protected, and the original search for new frontiers and innovation has become monetized. It shows an objectification of American culture as its citizens scramble to, as Corkin says, Marxianize the American tradition before you can sell the American worker on the social revolution. His characters wish to be heard in their own vision of proletarian empowerment and a liberation of society, yet the mechanism of an ordering history has developed an impetus that overrides human control altogether. As the newsreels create snippets of American life and the everyday citizen, Dos Passos preempts any acts of recognition in this chaos of representation. Max struggles against his predetermined state of being successively, while his potential later self, Deb, a resolute public figure, refuses to function as a role model and thus obscures his own potential vision for the chaos and its potential ordering. Quote, I don't want you to follow me or anyone else. I would not lead you into the promised land if I could. Because if I could lead you in, someone else could lead you out. Unquote. It seems the lack of self-empowered, self-willed consciousness to create a less polar new America has changed from the early days of the promised land. There is no public scope of political acuity to the individualized visions. They concentrate on their own identity just as much as on the larger philosophical vision. All of them show a different aspect of a general predefined concept of nation that obscures the meaning and vision that Dos Passos associated with the 18th century in the first place. He instead believes that industrialization has now tightened its grip and checked democracy and citizens alike. As Diggins says, in capitalist society, men do not have lives. They have only destinies. End quote. This prevents the formation of a cultural identity along Baba's concept of the formation of nations. There is a performative dimension reminding everyone of the open facts of existence, but this voice seems stifled by the view of pre-existing lack of power of the oppressed. Amid this lack of a voice, he attempts to recuperate the power of popular songs in reinforcing ideology through the insertion of patriotic lyrics. Mac's favorite song, America, is not used to give empowerment to the leftists, but as a sign of the pervasiveness of capitalist power fighting against revolutionary impulses. Baba's concept of pedagogical narration is stifled by the irony of the verse. Sweet land of liberty, land of the noble free, happy and free. Even the Star-Spangled Banner played in the last newsreel only creates a violent response among the listeners in the bar. Revolutionary tunes have become obfuscated by the economic machinery of the nation and leave no room for the creation of anything more than subtle changes. As art has succumbed to capitalist democracy, Dos Passos chooses to focus on the atmosphere rather than the words of the individual biographies. Figures like Horatio Alger, who work their way from a disadvantageous state to higher ground through ambition, are sarcastically mocked by Dos Passos, as he titles his Max story, From the Ground Up. And he never gets up from the ground. In essence, Dos Passos omits any larger figures that bring about change to concentrate on what he termed the surrounding average people in a painting or novel. As he compares the new novel structure to a tableau, Dos Passos paints what fascinated him, quote, a tableau with large figures of saints surrounded by a lot of little people, yet without the saints that could save the nation. In a way, this becomes its own form of novel and novelistic protest. Nevertheless, the epic story of America might be mourned for as one nation at least. Both the old and the new nation are described in terms of affective experiences and their desire for connection, comradeship within a larger collectivity of like-minded individuals. Mac's ideology is shaped by the familial background of his father's lost job, his mother's premature death, while Ben's commitment is seriously tempted and both aided and weakened by his intellectual background. Mary, as a character, wishes to replace her mother, a socially and personally compassionate woman, as the novel describes her, in the patriarchal role as protagonist in an Oedipal drama. Janie, a secretary, who then moves from Washington to New York because her boss develops anti-German sentiments. She ponders whether she should have married instead and could have come home to a roaring fireplace now. Class ambition, educational advancement, and diverse family connection are neither more egalitarian leftist or any less interwoven than the structure of the 18th century. What Dos Passos believes to have been lost has in fact barely ever existed. The narrative structure of, quote, success before suppression, unquote, is not unique to the 20th century, but the privilege of forming the concept of a new nation in the 18th century was pushed through also not just by individuals of lesser privilege. Much power rested with well-educated capitalist and authoritative members of politics and institutions. In a way, the American epic story is thus a fiction insisting on losses that precede and preempt accomplishment. Much progress, for instance, was hard to accomplish in a short amount of time, and the heroes of the early days did not necessarily remain so in the course of history. Progress, history, and democracy as the ultimate destination have been defined in vastly different ways, however. Rather than first reading the epigraph of a nameless young man hitchhiking across the country in search of the American dream, which comes much later, the novel opens with newsreels of soldiers charging up the hill in the Spanish-American War and a forward movement designed to set the tone for the rest of the novel. It is, according to Robert Butler, symbolic of, quote, the regeneration of the world, physical as well as moral, that has begun, and revolutions never move backwards, end quote. Progress could thus both include war and violent exchanges, not necessarily have its focus on unity or the adaptation of natural principles and harmony as in Whitman's version. The 42nd parallel shows peace and war, as well as the dissolution of the dividing lines through labor unrest, European Revolution, and the first seeds of the World War. Mr. Robbins calls it, quote, the goddamnedest treason in history. Not sure about the pronunciation here because the spelling is a little different here too. Is progress thus that much different from unrest or merely an interruption of the senseless drift of many characters in the novel? Even at his bleakest view of America in 1919, Dos Passos was more hopeful about the American continent rather than the European one. Quote, I admit America is to me more dear than Europe. Probably its colossal hideousness, its febrile insanity are evolving toward a better life for man, end quote. There's still hope for innovation and imagining a new nation, as characters are nonetheless also given positive meanings. Mary eventually leaves conventional social service work for a more independent life in Pittsburgh and Cleveland. She even has a kind of moral and intellectual awakening in her political work, even though it's not necessarily treated too favorable in the novel. The later on more important vagabond does not get a name as a wanderer until the third book of the trilogy, The Big Money. But he's present throughout, going from nowhere to nowhere in the same tradition as Cooper's Deerslayer or Twain's Huckleberry Finn, who also does not have a fixed social role. The indeterminacy of these characters could be a positive feature, as Dos Passos gave them a more romantic, artistic, and hopeful image, as many others. In fact, much of the admiration of progress for Dos Passos lay in the innovative and practical capabilities of people who retained their own values, despite the barriers that life threw at them. It is a much less romantic vision than we find in Emerson and Thoreau, but still embodies a kind of romantic belief in oneself and the future. Heroism comes in varied forms in democratic settings, especially in the 20th century. Even as happiness and achievement are only occasionally granted, none of them are giving heroic status, as the narration should never just succumb to the prescriptions of doctrine. The only heroism to find is thus the individual struggle against oppression, along their resourcefulness and taking leaps of faith, even if they are repeatedly put down. We do not find de Tocqueville's American farmers achieving sustainable independence for the nation, or Benjamin Franklin's self-educated success stories, as even Ben's own failure and imprisonment destroyed his success for some time. It is, however, easier to pinpoint the general failures of individuals in society, as Dos Passos determines these to be self-interest, materialism, shallowness, and cynicism. In a way, his vision serves to correct Whitman's idea of democracy, as the latter would also have included expansionist and imperialist aspects. And as the very first pages of the 42nd parallel reiterate, I do not, as some do, look upon territorial expansion as the safest and most attractive avenue of national development. International vistas are not the solution to the post-industrial problems of America either. Neither is the 42nd parallel a fictional place of pastoral refreshment. The increasing grandeur, technological machinery, and capitalist efforts of the new nation of the post-industrial age do not show such sentiments of recuperating through nature. On the one hand, the reader sees the guiding documentation of the narrator, and on the other hand, lonely crowds and scattered individuals in urban spaces or foreign locations such as Mexico and Europe. The only nature that is shown is the occasional river, lake, or ocean, but usually in derogatory terms, such as rotting ice, gardens full of cops, or the big body of water that makes character Charlie sick. The evolution of characters is entirely cut off from its natural predecessors, as city streets become the omnipresent screen for characters, ultimately showing the world as it is. Readers have to content themselves with spontaneity of action and caricatures in a purely urban and proletarian aesthetics. Dos Passos judges somewhat differently when acting as a historian in his other writings from 1941 onward. Each generation, in his view, interprets the past differently, but the past also offers continuity in difficult times, similar to a lifeline. He himself seeks no reactionary nostalgia per se, but rather the means or mostly force that had made Americans free and aware of this freedom in order to build a better future than during post-industrial capitalism. The new kind of America is supposed to be different and safe, contrary to what character Charlie says on his way to France: freedom to work so that the bosses can get rich, opportunity to starve to death if you get fired from your job. This is my last paragraph. In his view, men of vision and dedication who assume responsibility beyond themselves are truly the ideal for America. Success is no longer attached to wealth or political power for Dos Passos. In the industrialist Barrow's view, the power void and First World War in Europe is America's great opportunity because the thieves fall out. Similarly, Andrew Carnegie is given a biography in the novel, but even his giving millions for peace is described as suspect, and Theodore Roosevelt is deemed equally patronizing. Just as Woodrow Wilson, the narrator, treats Roosevelt as someone who lacks a genuine humanist impulse. Dos Passos' focus in historical writings always lies with the small businessman or farmer, or what he terms their commonwealth, as a vital part in struggling to save democratic government. This true vagrant or average American is, for the most part, however, forgotten in the 42nd parallel and left for the reader to be found in this chronicle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jauch. Sierra?
Hi. I am just going to jump right in for time. Fahrenheit 451, though a dystopian text, provides a very real image of what the future of America could come to be. Set in an unnamed city, fireman Guy Montag works with a dedicated team to set ablaze the homes of those found to contain the most forbidden contraband literature. The reader sees a swift and intense transformation of Montag from a law-abiding citizen to a protector of the written word, inciting rebellion and escaping nuclear warfare in order to carry on memorized sections of the Bible with a group of like-minded individuals headed towards a better world. This dystopia critically ends in the complete annihilation of Montag's city by nuclear bomb. Though the novel is not frequently cited as an anti-war text, this destruction allows for a deeper reading through the context of the atomic age, as fears of the bomb were growing in post-war America. In particular, authors of science fiction were noted as particularly prevalent in addressing these fears, as Albert Berger notes in 1979, quote, "The writers of pulp magazine science fiction found themselves in an ambivalent position after the explosion over Hiroshima of the first atomic bomb. On the one hand, they were acknowledged as prophets proven right by the course of events. Some of them began new careers as consultants and participants in government and university-sponsored seminars on social and technological change," end quote. This is interesting when paired with Bradbury's own view of the genre, as he called science fiction the last refuge for free thinkers at the height of McCarthyism, and that despite being probed by the FBI in a file which claims he had been critical of the US government and the House Committee on Un-American Activities, he hadn't explicitly been called a communist, even though, as Bradbury states, quote, "I have written stories against book burning, excessive mechanization, police and thought control, and fascism in high places. I imagine that no one has thought to call me a communist because I have laid the stories in the future," end quote. Therefore, navigating the literary world in America post-atomic bomb was inherently connected to the growing culture of fear in American society exhibited through Senator McCarthy's policies. The origins of Fahrenheit 451 can be interpreted as stemming from these forces, as the novel's inspiration began with the short story The Pedestrian, written after Bradbury was accosted by a police officer during a casual nighttime stroll in 1949 as, quote, "If the rights of the pedestrian were threatened, this would represent an early indicator that basic freedoms would soon be at risk." In the wake of the 1952 election, in which Bradbury openly and enthusiastically supported the Stevenson ballot, Jonathan Eller writes that the author was, quote, "increasingly disturbed by the reluctance of liberals to stand up to Joe McCarthy." In fact, Bradbury was already targeted. As early as 1950, his lecture at Los Angeles City College was canceled by the English department, and that the reluctance of editors and publishers to print any of these stories during the early 1950s suppresses a significant aspect of Bradbury's evolution as a writer in post-war America, end quote. He attributes this unwillingness to President Eisenhower's eventual win, which allows for an argument that to separate Fahrenheit 451 from its ascribed political connotations is to ignore the very elements of 1950s culture reflected in the novel, as censorship is a political issue as well as a moral one. Though the novel is centered around book burning and the effects of censorship on an imagined American future, it has historically not been able to escape real-life censorship since its first printing in 1953. Incidents of censorship of the novel documented throughout American public sectors have been fought for in the name of preservation of religious ideals, as well as the fight against the exposure of profanity to minors. Perhaps the most notable of these incidents was done by Bradbury's own publisher, Ballantine Books, in a 1967 edition without Bradbury's consent or knowledge. Eventually dumped the Bal High edition, this copy of the text had been designed specifically for high school students where, quote, "over 75 passages were modified to eliminate such words as hell, damn, and abortion, and 2 incidents were eliminated." In these cases, the issue of censorship is shown to be limited not to an aggressive school board, district, or legislative body, but enacted by those who are often entrusted to deliver the source material as it was written, instead altering it to satisfy whomever the right market for book selling was at the time. This falls in line with Bradbury's intended meaning behind the text, which turns the reader's focus to the fact that the culprit behind thought control is not always the government, but the average citizen indebted to their culture. Though science fiction was not unknown before this decade, it gained new traction in the 1950s, as noted by August Derleth in 1952, as he remarked, quote, "Contemporary interest in this fiction form was stimulated by the use of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, and the vistas opened to the imagination by the effect of the bomb on the patterns of human thought, with the renewal of speculation about interplanetary travel." He further argues that the genre developed as writers of science fiction began to write beyond plot, penning stories representative of deeper philosophical thought, despite their abnormal or fantastical settings. Science fiction, Joe Petrug argues, promoted these new ideologies in a way that more modernist forms of fiction could not, as they contained settings which allowed for the reader to adapt to change. He writes, quote, "The reader normally lives in the real world. Then he's back in an alternate one the next time he reads another science fiction story. Experiencing all these changes in setting and environment, the reader is trained to accept change." So, in other words, science fiction is more than escapism, but an introduction on dismantling social norms. If there are no rules when it pertains to realism, then all thought processes and possibilities are now opened up to the reader. This could also have provided a sense of control for the reader in an atomic age otherwise fraught with helplessness and fear. Thematically, another defining element of the text is the distractions of modern technology. Since it is encouraged by the government and demonstrated through the families on TV screens paneling every home, they function as a method of keeping the impending war at an arm's length from the public. As David Seed notes, quote, Mildred's house combines all the electronic gadgetry associated with the 50s good life. But these things have a cost. The experience of one consumable can only be understood through comparison with another, and here the individual is put into a posture of maximum passivity as subjected to machines, not their controller. Quote, the maximum passivity here is represented in not only the attitudes towards the impending war, but the weapons used in the war itself. Bradbury exhibits the natural outcome of this dangerous combination at the very end of the novel, where the impact of the war, right before the all-consuming explosion which destroys the city in full, is finally seen by Montag as something which is not secondary to his own plight, but integral in what has inspired his actions as he talks with Faber. Quote, you know the war's on, I heard. God, isn't it funny, said the old man. It seems so remote because we have our own troubles, end quote. The characters see their own troubles as a separate entity from the war, despite the fact that Montag has engulfed himself in actions against the very body of government which controls this war. Seed continues, quote, the result of this process in Fahrenheit 451 is a consumer culture completely divorced from political awareness. An oral refrain running through the novel is the din of passing bombers, which has simply become background noise, end quote. This is an implicit form of sociological censorship seen throughout the novel. Though the burning, of one's beloved literature seems to be the major pitfall of the dystopia, the ignorance of what has been written and then subsequently confiscated from the public has all manifested from a manufactured consent and only increased with the progression of modern technology, where everything one could want or need is now available at the touch of a button. A further implication of technological distractions in the novel is the presence of the mechanical hound, which serves as evidence of a surveillance state within the dystopia, related to the government's subtle forms of retaining control, and even related to McCarthyism's methods of prying into the individual lives of Americans to achieve condemnation. Though Montag is used to the robotic dog, he first begins to take notice of its presence, finally, when he wonders about the agency of the hound itself. Quote, I was just figuring, said Montag, what does the hound think about down there at night? Is it coming alive on us, really? It makes me cold. It doesn't think anything we don't want it to think. That's sad, said Montag quietly, because all we put into it is hunting and finding and killing. What a shame if that's all it can ever know, end quote. The collective we used by Montag here is important, as it is a reminder that the actions of each speak to the society as a whole. He realizes the small ways he has contributed to a community of coercive control and violence. Even though the hound is referred to and meant to be seen as an independent body, Captain Beatty goes on to admit at the end that it has always been under the control of those in powers when he remarks, quote, well, now you did it. Old Montag wanted to fly near the sun, and now that he's burnt his damn wings, he wonders why. Didn't I hint enough when I sent the hound around your place, end quote. His questioning of how Montag could not have understood the warning is also then an admittance that the citizens should, on an unconscious level, know who is really in control at all times. In other words, one may be given agency as a citizen, but even those in power know of the manufactured consent they promote, and the governed body should be aware of this too. It is also symbolic that Montag begins the novel in a position of power as a loyal and unassuming firefighter. It is not insignificant that Montag is unaware of the why behind the burning of the books done. This element is critical to get the job done, as Montag is only useful as a pawn for authority figures if he has no real opinions about the reasonings behind book burnings. His thinking and questioning of the morals surrounding the act is akin to one asking about the dangers of communism. Seed writes, quote, "One of Montag's earliest realizations in the novel is that his house is exactly like thousands of others, identical and therefore capable of substitution. It could never be his own," end quote. This realization of Montag's is one of the first notions that he is an other in society and will likely do something radical in order to find his way out before the novel's end. The moment he begins to develop his own thoughts and ideas about the wider world, he is subjected to the same oversight and control as those feared enemies of the state. This division is what contributed to the very power dynamics that embodied the McCarthy era: those who interrogated potential communists and those who were questioned. At the conclusion of the novel, the destruction of the city is done so succinctly and swiftly, the characters are unable to process what has happened, are unsure if they even saw what was the last act of annihilation above them in the sky, or if it was just a trick of the eye, due to the seemingly hallucinatory state the majority of the characters operate in. The ultimate ending of the novel, wherein the city is engulfed in flames, symbolizes the fears of the bomb coming true. A society so concerned with consumerism it has turned in on itself, a true form of self-destruction. The apathy towards the war's violent impact on other people is seen again amongst Montag's wife and her friends when they discuss politics, remarking that it is always someone else, never anyone they know, who is truly affected. Quote, "When do you suppose the war will start?" he said. "I notice your husbands aren't here tonight." The three women fidgeted and looked nervously at the empty wall. "I'm not worried," said Mrs. Phelps. "I'll let Pete do all the worrying. It's always someone else's husband dies, they say." "I've heard that too. I've never known any man killed in war. Killed jumping off buildings, yes, like Gloria's husband last week, but from wars, no." End quote. The moment the distraction of the television screens is turned off, the women are immediately nervous as they are forced to have a genuine conversation about the danger surrounding them. Yet even the flippant mention of one of their social circle's husband's suicide is glossed over, a true mark of how robotic and well-adjusted to the oppressive society they have become. Seed further comments on the meaning of these implications of mass media within the text as he writes, quote, "Fahrenheit 451 dramatizes the effects of the media as substitutions. Millie finds an ersatz intimacy with the family on the screen, which contrasts markedly with her relation to Montag. Millie and her friends are defined entirely by their roles as consumers, whether of sedatives, soap operas, or fast cars." End quote. With Seed's analysis, the consumerist culture which plagues the dystopian society in Fahrenheit 451 is then not only a distraction to the ongoings of the war, but a method for deadening the emotions of the characters when it comes to conflict. As emotional responses and personal narratives which come from war are often inciting factors for social change, protests, and other acts of resistance, this consumerism is very purposeful. It is Bradbury urging his audience to understand that if war is seen as something happening to the other and not the average citizen, it is that very moment when it will be able to engulf everyone. Even the final scenes of war in the novel begin and end so quickly that the characters have little to no room to process what is happening to them until it was over. Quote, "Look," cried Montag, "and the war began and ended in that instant," end quote. Finally, Montag's personification of the war at the end of the novel provides a connection between experimental fiction and understanding political conflict. Instead of seeing destruction as a means to an end in wartime, the bomb is villainized, given a voice which everyone can relate to. This final moment of him reaching to the sky and lamenting what has been lost, wondering about those taken from him and if they have been spared from the flames of the burning city, gives an unshakable feeling of helplessness as an individual in the midst of war. Quote, "Montag saw the flirt of a great metal fist over the far city, and he knew the scream of the jets that would follow, would say after the deed, disintegrate, leave no stone on another, perish, die. Montag held the bombs in the sky for a single moment, with his mind and his hands reaching helplessly up to them," end quote. Here there is the greatest intersection of the historical and political contexts surrounding the themes of the book and the pathos of the fiction. There is an emotional element behind each of the political actions and implicit censorship the public is subject to. Popular literature of this given decade, with a wide berth of circulation and discourse surrounding it, was, and still is, able to connect the broader actions of a powerful nation's government to the average reader at home trying to contend with war's continuing impact on humanity. Though Bradbury's ideas were revolutionary during science fiction's expansion to mainstream readers and McCarthyism's impact on the book publishing industry, it is also crucial to note that censorship, literary or otherwise, is not confined to a single time in history. When discussing the obstacles faced by his own works, Bradbury wrote, quote, "Without a knowledge of our lies, our deceits, our greed, through which runs a narrow vein of thoughtfulness and good, we would go on repeating the same mistakes in the same way," end quote. Through an open and explicit condemnation of the suppressive forces behind his work, as well as an emphasis on the power of the individual teacher, reader, or consumer to push back against censors, Bradbury made his stance clear. The novel's ending and its important phrase, "thought internally by Montag," in the last line of the text, which reads, "When we reach the city," encompasses all of these ideas and allows for an optimistic reading of an anti-war novel in a turbulent post-war America, with the bright notion that reading Fahrenheit 451 is in itself a small act of rebellion. Thank you.